Santiago was a successful and respected man, having built his life through hard work and dedication. His world, however, was shattered when he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. At first, he leaned on his family for support, but soon his wife and daughter began to drift away. Despite their promises to stand by him, they left him to face his final months alone. But just when Santiago thought he would be abandoned completely, his lifelong friend Miguel and Miguel's caring daughter Isabella stepped in. They brought warmth and companionship, refusing to let him suffer in solitude. Through their selfless love and dedication, Santiago discovered that true family isn't always bound by blood. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Before we dive into this story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Santiago had always been a man of routine, someone who thrived on structure and order. At 52, he had built a highly respected car dealership in the city, a business he had nurtured with dedication and hard work over the years. Every day for him followed a precise pattern. He would rise early, enjoy a simple breakfast, skim through his reports, and make his way to the showroom. There he would ensure every detail was in place, as control and predictability were the keys to his success. Life for him was like a well-oiled machine. But lately the machine has started to malfunction. Santiago began feeling an unsettling fatigue, one that sapped his strength in ways he had never experienced before. At first, he brushed it off as the inevitable toll of running a demanding business. Surely it was just stress, something that a good night's sleep could cure. Yet, as days turned into weeks, his energy drained further and his appetite vanished. His wife, Carmen, noticed the change and begged him to see a doctor. Santiago, stubborn and fiercely independent, refused. He despised wasting time on such matters, believing his body would eventually heal itself. Then came the morning that would change everything. As Santiago rose from bed, a wave of dizziness nearly knocked him to the ground. He grasped onto the dresser, feeling the world tilt beneath him. It was then, in that disorienting moment, that he realized he could no longer ignore what was happening. With growing apprehension, he finally agreed to see Dr. Teresa, their trusted family physician. The waiting room at Dr. Teresa's office was warm and inviting, with soft pastel walls and paintings of peaceful landscapes meant to soothe anxious patients. But Santiago couldn't shake the feeling that his world was about to unravel. He sat there, trying to calm the storm of worry brewing inside him, as memories of his once robust health mocked him. When the nurse called his name, a cold shiver crept down his spine. Dr. Teresa greeted him with her usual kindness, but her face grew serious as he described the troubling symptoms. Without hesitation, she ordered a series of tests. The following days were a blur of waiting, a different kind of waiting this time. Santiago, usually so impatient, found himself dreading the results. Deep inside, he feared that this wasn't just another fleeting health issue. When the call came to return to the office, the pit in his stomach deepened. He entered the doctor's office, and the air felt thick with unspoken truth. "Doctor!" Teresa's eyes were heavy with concern, her once reassuring smile replaced by a somber expression. She took a deep breath, and in a voice that was both gentle and firm, delivered the news that shattered his world. Cancer. Terminal. The words echoed in Santiago's mind, distant and unreal, as if they were meant for someone else. Suddenly, the life Santiago had so carefully built began to crumble before his eyes. All the control he once cherished was slipping through his fingers like sand, leaving him to grapple with the harsh reality of his mortality. Little did he know this diagnosis would not only test his strength but also reveal the heartbreaking truth about the people closest to him. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 1 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. His wife, Carmen, and his daughter, who had once been his greatest treasures, would soon abandon him when he needed them most. Months would pass, and they would return not out of love or concern, but driven by greed for the inheritance they assumed would soon be theirs. However, what awaited them upon their return was something far more profound than they could ever have imagined. Santiago sat there, his heart pounding in his chest, as the words 6 months to live echoed in his mind like a cruel sentence. How could this be happening to him? He had always been proud of his strength, his vitality. He'd always taken care of himself, exercised regularly, and avoided excess. Now the very life he had spent so much time nurturing was slipping away from him, like sand falling through his fingers. Each word from Dr. Teresa felt like a dagger to his soul, tearing through the very fabric of the world he knew. Leaving the doctor's office, The vibrant world outside seemed to have dulled. The colors of the streets, the faces of people passing by, all of it felt distant and alien, as if he were suddenly a stranger in his own life. The usual comfort he found in his surroundings had evaporated. The drive home, which usually helped clear his mind, felt longer than ever, and for the first time in years he didn't turn on the radio. The silence in the car mirrored the chaos in his mind, and the weight of his diagnosis pressed down on him like an unbearable burden. When he finally arrived home, Carmen immediately sensed something was off. Her brow furrowed with concern as she asked, "What's wrong?" But Santiago, still reeling from the shock, couldn't find the strength to explain. He muttered something about needing time and retreated to his office, a room that had always been his sanctuary. There, surrounded by framed family photos and accolades from his business success, the gravity of his situation finally began to sink in. His eyes fell on a photo of Rafaela as a little girl, her face beaming as she sat in one of the cars from his dealership. He had built everything for her, for them, the long hours, the missed vacations, also his family could have a comfortable life. Now, as he faced his mortality, all those achievements seemed hollow. What was the point of it all if he wouldn't be there to enjoy it, to see his daughter grow, to spend more time with his wife? The following days were a fog of fear and reflection. Santiago barely ate, sleep eluded him, and his thoughts were consumed by the looming question: how do you tell your family that your time is running out? How do you shatter their world with the knowledge that you will soon be gone? The thought of Carmen's tears or Rafael's broken heart was unbearable. He had always been their rock, their protector, but now he was the one who needed to be saved, and no one could save him from this. As the days passed, Santiago realized that cancer wasn't his only enemy. Time itself had become his greatest adversary. He felt like he was in a race, with every passing moment pulling him further away from the life he had known and closer to an uncertain and terrifying end. Each sunset seemed more final, more foreboding. The future he had always believed was within his control was now slipping away, leaving him powerless to stop it. Then came the morning when he knew he couldn't delay any longer. The air was crisp and cold, and the heavy clouds overhead mirrored the weight in his heart. Carmen was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast, unaware of the storm that was about to descend. Santiago stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, feeling a profound sorrow wash over him. He knew that once he spoke the words, everything would change. With trembling hands, he approached her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Carmen, we need to talk," he whispered, his voice barely able to carry the weight of the words. She turned to him, her smile fading as she saw the pain etched on his face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tinged with fear. Santiago sat down at the table, his heart heavy with the truth he had been dreading to share. "I went to the doctor," he began, struggling to keep his composure. "It's cancer, and it's terminal. They've given me 6 months to live." The room fell silent. Carmen's face went pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. It was as if the world had suddenly stopped turning, and in that moment they were both suspended in a shared grief so deep, it felt like they could drown in it. Santiago reached out for her hand, his shaking. The fight that lay ahead wasn't just against the illness, it was against the sorrow, the fear, and the inevitable end that was creeping closer with every heartbeat. Together they would have to face the unthinkable. For a moment, an agonizing silence settled over the kitchen. Carmen blinked, trying to grasp the gravity of what she had just heard. Her mind was racing, her heart aching, but she refused to let the tears fall. She quickly wiped her eyes, unwilling to surrender to the crushing despair that threatened to overwhelm her. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking but firm. "This can't be true. You've always been so strong, Santiago. You've always been the pillar of our family. There must be some kind of mistake." She clung to that hope, desperately searching for something to hold on to. Santiago, his face etched with pain, gently shook his head. "I wish I could tell you it was a mistake too, but it's not. Dr. Teresa was very clear. There's no treatment, no cure. We have to face this together and prepare for what's coming." Carmen felt her throat tighten, the lump growing harder to swallow, but she refused to fall apart. Not now, not in front of him. She reached out and grasped his hand, holding it tightly, as if her strength alone could keep him tethered to this life. Her gaze locked with his, her eyes filled with determination. "We will face this together, Santiago. I'm not leaving your side. I'll be here every step of the way. You don't have to go through this alone." Her words, spoken with unwavering conviction, pierced through the haze of fear clouding Santiago's mind. It brought him a glimmer of peace, knowing that he wouldn't have to walk this path alone. After a few moments, he sighed deeply, his thoughts turning to their daughter. "We need to tell Rafaela," he said quietly, his voice laced with worry. "She deserves to know." Carmen nodded, though the concern in her eyes deepened. Rafaela had always been emotionally sensitive, and breaking this news to her felt like an unbearable task. How would she cope with knowing her father's days were numbered? That evening, Rafaela came home, her usual bright energy filling the house. But when she saw her parents sitting together on the couch, their faces somber, the lightness in her step vanished. "Mom? Dad? What's going on?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry as she sensed the gravity of the moment. Santiago took a deep breath and asked her to sit down. As he had done with Carmen, he struggled to find the words, but eventually he told her the heartbreaking truth. The room seemed to freeze as Rafaela sat in stunned silence, her eyes filled with disbelief, then with the unmistakable pain of realization. Slowly, tears welled up and began streaming down her cheeks, her expression a reflection of the devastation that gripped her heart. "No, this can't be happening," she whispered through her tears, shaking her head as if rejecting the very idea. "Dad, you're the strongest person I know. You can't be sick like this. You just can't." Santiago reached out and gently took her hand in his grip firm but tender. "I know, sweetheart. I know it's hard to believe, but we have to face this together. I need you now more than ever." His voice was filled with both sorrow and love, and as Rafaela looked into his eyes, she crumbled into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "I promise I'll be here for you, Dad. We'll take care of you. We won't leave you. We won't abandon you." Her words, though spoken through tears, were filled with such love and loyalty that Santiago's heart swelled with gratitude. He wrapped his arms around her tightly, feeling her warmth and love easing some of the pain he carried. In that embrace, he found the strength he so desperately needed. Though the road ahead was uncertain and filled with darkness, knowing that his family would stand by him gave him the courage to face whatever lay ahead. The days that followed were filled with an unspoken bond between the three of them, rooted in love and an unyielding determination to make every moment count. Carmen, despite her heartbreak, threw herself into caring for Santiago, ensuring that he was as comfortable as possible. Every meal, every gesture, every word she spoke was a quiet act of love. Rafaela, too, became a constant presence, spending more time at home and doing her best to keep the house filled with laughter and light. They avoided talking too much about the inevitable future, choosing instead to live fully in the present, to savor each day as a gift. There was a silent understanding between them they would cherish every moment as if it were the last. This unspoken agreement brought a kind of peace to Santiago's soul. He knew the battle ahead would be the hardest he had ever faced, but with Carmen and Rafaela beside him, he felt ready. The love that surrounded him gave him a sense of hope, not for survival, but for the strength to face whatever time he had left with dignity and grace. In the end, it wasn't the cancer that would define his last days. It was the love, the unwavering support, and the memories they created together in those precious moments. It was knowing that, even as his body failed him, his family would carry on, their hearts full of the love he had poured into them. And that, more than anything, gave him the strength to face whatever came next. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 2 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. As the days went by, Santiago could feel the subtle yet undeniable shifts in Carmen and Rafaela's behavior. Despite their promises to stand by him, the tension in the house grew heavier with each passing moment, like an invisible weight pressing down on all of them. The ever-present specter of his impending death hung over the family, quietly chipping away at the peace and love they once shared. For Santiago, the toll of the illness was becoming more unbearable. Everyday tasks that once required no effort, like getting out of bed or walking to the living room, now left him drained. He fought hard to maintain a facade of strength, not wanting to burden his family with the grim reality of how quickly the disease was advancing. But his exhaustion couldn't be hidden forever, and Carmen began to notice. Instead of offering comfort, though, she began to pull away both physically and emotionally. Where Carmen had once been his rock, always by his side, her warmth now seemed to vanish. Her days were spent in a routine of silence and avoidance, as if she were searching for distractions to numb the pain. She would busy herself with small, insignificant tasks, cleaning already clean surfaces or folding laundry that didn't need folding, anything to avoid confronting the growing distance between them. When Santiago tried to talk about what they were going through, she would respond with short, clip sentences, or deflect the conversation entirely. It was as if an impenetrable wall had sprung up between them, leaving Santiago feeling more isolated than ever. The emotional coldness from Carmen pierced him deeper than any physical agony his body endured. Then there was Rafaela. Her change was even more abrupt and more painful to witness. The young woman who had once vowed to be there for her father had started spending more and more time outside the house. At first, Santiago had convinced himself that she was just trying to cope in her way, seeking solace in her friends or activities that gave her an escape. But as the weeks passed, her absences became longer and more frequent. She would return late at night, smelling of alcohol, her eyes red and swollen, betraying nights spent partying instead of grieving. Conversations with Rafaela became nearly non-existent. She barely interacted with her parents, retreating to her room whenever she was home, shutting herself off from the world and Santiago. He could see the turmoil she was in, but her way of dealing with the situation only deepened his feelings of abandonment. The one person he had always believed would stand by him seemed to be slipping further away, lost in her world of pain and avoidance. Santiago tried to reach out to her, hoping to understand what was happening inside her mind. He would sit with her, gently asking if she was all right if she wanted to talk. But each attempt was met with evasions or dismissals. "I'm fine, Dad. I just need some time for myself," she would say, her eyes darting away, unwilling to meet his gaze. It was clear to Santiago that she wasn't fine, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't break through the barrier she had put up. Carmen, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to Rafaela's behavior, or perhaps she simply didn't care. She remained locked in her world of silence and withdrawal, leaving Santiago feeling utterly alone in his fight. The once lively home that had been filled with laughter and love was now eerily quiet, with empty chairs at the dinner table and the flickering glow of a television no one watched. Santiago often found himself eating alone, the silence around him suffocating, a cruel reminder of how much had changed. One night, after yet another of Rafaela's late returns, Santiago decided he couldn't let this continue. He needed answers, and more than that, he needed his daughter back. When she finally walked through the door, her face pale and her eyes clouded with sadness, Santiago summoned what little strength he had left and asked her to sit with him. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he knew the conversation had to happen. They sat together on the couch, the air thick with tension. Santiago's voice was calm but heavy with emotion as he asked, "Rafaela, why are you pulling away? Why are you distancing yourself so much from us, from me?" He watched her closely, his heart aching as she stared down at the floor, avoiding his eyes. After what felt like an eternity, Rafaela finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do, Dad. I can't stand being here, watching you get worse every day. It's too much. I feel helpless and I don't know how to handle it. So I go out and I try to forget, even if it's just for a few hours." Her words broke Santiago's heart, but he understood her pain all too well. He reached out, gently squeezing her hand, his voice soft but filled with desperation. "I know it's hard, Rafaela. I know you're hurting, but I need you. I need my daughter. We don't have much time left, and I can't do this alone. I need you to be here with me, not just physically, but emotionally." Rafaela's eyes welled with tears, and for a brief moment, Santiago thought he had reached her. But just as quickly as her emotions surfaced, she pulled away. Standing abruptly, she mumbled, "I need some air," and disappeared into her room, leaving Santiago alone once again in the empty living room. The silence that followed was deafening. Santiago sat there staring at the spot where his daughter had been, his heart heavy with a profound sense of loss. Not the loss of his life that he had come to terms with, but the loss of the closeness he once shared with his family. The cancer may have been destroying his body, but it was the unraveling of his family that was truly breaking his heart. The emotional distance between Santiago and Carmen cut deeper than any physical ailment ever could. Carmen's presence was there just a few feet away in their shared home, but emotionally, she was drifting further from him with each passing day. Santiago tried time and time again to reach out to her, to bridge the growing gap, but every attempt was met with cold detachment. It was as though Carmen, the woman who had always been his anchor, the one who had held their family together through every storm, was slowly disintegrating under the weight of her grief and fear. For Carmen, Santiago's illness wasn't just the impending loss of her husband, it was a harsh reminder of her mortality. The idea of losing him was so terrifying that she built walls around herself, locking away her emotions and trying to shield herself from the pain. Santiago could sense this, but it didn't lessen the sting of her distance. He needed her more than ever, her love, her comfort, her touch, but she seemed to be slipping away into her world of sorrow and confusion. The nights were the worst. Santiago would lie next to Carmen in their bed, the woman he had loved for so many years, yet he felt more alone than ever. He could hear her breathing next to him and feel the warmth of her body close by. But the emotional chasm between them felt like an uncrossable void. He would toss and turn, not from the physical pain of his illness, but from the gnawing ache in his heart. One night, unable to bear the silence, he tried to open up to her, to tell her how he was feeling, but she simply turned her back, mumbling that she was too tired to talk. That simple gesture of dismissal shattered him. The house, once filled with laughter, warmth, and endless conversations about their dreams and the future, now felt like a hollow shell. Santiago yearned for Rafaela's laughter, for the lively discussions he used to have with Carmen about the life they had built together and the adventures they still planned to embark on. Now everything was suffocated by the looming presence of death, the cold shadow that had swallowed up their joy. Santiago began to feel not just weak in body, but utterly defeated in spirit. The weight of loneliness was crushing him from the inside out, making him question how much longer he could hold on. The only solace he found was in the memories of happier times, moments of joy, laughter, and love that he clung to like a lifeline. He replayed those memories in his mind, hoping they would give him the strength to keep going. But even those cherished recollections began to feel distant, fading like a dream slipping out of reach. The days became painfully long for Santiago. With Carmen and Rafaela retreating into their worlds, the silence in the house became almost unbearable. The solitude pressed down on him, making the walls of the house feel smaller and smaller, trapping him in a space that once felt like home, but now felt like a prison. He feared that the cancer wouldn't be what ultimately destroyed him. It was the abandonment, the emotional detachment of the people he loved most that was killing him slowly, suffocating him with every passing day. Just as Santiago was on the verge of despair, a small but significant ray of hope appeared in his life. That hope came in the form of Miguel, his lifelong friend. Miguel and Santiago had been inseparable since childhood. They had grown up together in a modest neighborhood where their days were filled with playing in the streets, dreaming of a better life, and sharing their hopes for the future. Though life had taken them down different paths, Santiago finding success in business while Miguel led a quieter life, their bond had never wavered. Miguel had always admired Santiago's accomplishments, but never let them create a divide between them. Instead, he celebrated his friend's success, proud to see how far Santiago had come from their humble beginnings. When Miguel heard of Santiago's illness, he didn't hesitate. Without a second thought, he made it a point to visit Santiago regularly, determined to be there for his friend in his darkest hour. For Miguel, friendship was more than just shared memories. It was a sacred connection, something that transcended success, hardship, and even the looming presence of death. Every time Miguel visited, Santiago felt a bit of his old self return. They would sit together, sometimes in silence, other times reminiscing about their childhood adventures or laughing about the silly things they had done as boys. Miguel didn't offer empty platitudes or try to pretend everything would be okay. Instead, he was simply present, offering Santiago the one thing he needed most: unconditional support. Miguel's visits brought a light into Santiago's otherwise dark days. He didn't push Santiago to talk about his illness unless Santiago wanted to. He just let him be, allowed him to feel whatever he needed to feel. That simple act of companionship, of showing up when everyone else seemed to be retreating, meant the world to Santiago. In those moments, with Miguel by his side, Santiago didn't feel quite so alone. It reminded him that, despite the emotional distance growing between him and his family, there were still people in his life who cared deeply and who wouldn't let him face the end alone. For Miguel, supporting Santiago was more than an obligation, it was an honor. He understood the fragility of life in a way that Santiago's family couldn't. He didn't try to fix anything or offer solutions, he just provided the steady presence of a friend who had been there since the beginning. And for Santiago, that presence was a lifeline, a reminder that despite the growing darkness, he wasn't completely abandoned. The love and loyalty of an old friend could still bring a glimmer of light into his life. In those moments with Miguel, Santiago found a bit of peace, a respite from the overwhelming loneliness. And while he still struggled with the emotional distance from Carmen and Rafaela, Miguel's unwavering support helped him realize that, even in his most vulnerable state, he wasn't entirely alone. There were still those who cared, who would walk beside him, even when the path grew dark. Miguel's visits had become a sanctuary for Santiago, a lifeline amid the growing darkness that enveloped his life. Each time Miguel arrived, his wide, sincere smile and boundless energy seemed to light up the house. Santiago, whose body grew weaker by the day, found his spirit lifted by these visits. They would sit in the living room or, if the weather was pleasant, in the garden. Miguel, with his gift for turning serious conversations into something light, would effortlessly bring a smile to Santiago's face. "Remember that time we nearly broke our legs trying to climb the neighbor's guava tree?" Miguel would laugh, his voice full of nostalgia. Santiago, despite the constant pain in his body, couldn't help but laugh along with him. "How could I forget? My mom nearly had a heart attack when she found out. I don't think we ever saw that tree again." These memories, filled with the innocence and mischief of youth, became a balm for Santiago's weary soul. They transported him back to a time when life was simple, when the biggest worries were school exams or convincing their parents to let them stay out past curfew. For those moments, the illness was forgotten, replaced by the comfort of friendship and shared history. Cancer, for a brief time, ceased to be the all-consuming force in his life, overshadowed by the bond that had survived decades of ups and downs. In addition to Miguel's comforting presence, a new source of light entered Santiago's life: Isabella, Miguel's 19-year-old daughter. She was a young woman brimming with dreams and ambitions, chief among them becoming a nurse. Yet, due to financial struggles, she had been forced to put that dream on hold. Still, her natural caregiving instincts had always been apparent, and when she learned of Santiago's condition, she immediately stepped in to help in any way she could. At first, Isabella accompanied her father during his visits, quietly helping with small chores around the house. But it didn't take long before she offered to take on a more active role in Santiago's care. She would prepare his medication, monitor his blood pressure, and ensure that he was as comfortable as possible. Her dedication was unwavering, and Santiago, who had been starved of this kind of care from his own family, found himself deeply touched by her kindness. "You have angelic hands," Isabella, Santiago would say, smiling gratefully as she adjusted his pillow or brought him a glass of water. "Thank you, Uncle Santiago," she would respond with a soft smile, using the affectionate title she had always called him. "It's the least I can do for someone who's been like family to my dad and me." Isabella's presence restored something to Santiago that he had been missing for so long: the feeling of being cared for, of being important to someone. Her gentle touch and sweet demeanor brought warmth back into his life that Carmen and Rafaela had long since stopped offering. Her visits, along with Miguel's, quickly became the highlights of his week. The three of them would sit together for hours, talking about everything from childhood memories to Isabella's aspirations to become a nurse. Miguel would share his stories with his characteristic flair, while Isabella listened intently, hanging on every word as though they were valuable lessons. "I always knew you were something special," Santiago, Miguel said one afternoon, his usual joking tone replaced by a rare moment of seriousness. "It wasn't just about the success you found, it was that you never forgot where you came from. That's what's always made you different." Santiago, moved by his friend's heartfelt words, felt a swell of gratitude mixed with a deep sadness. On one hand, he was thankful for the loyalty and love Miguel and Isabella showed him, but on the other, the growing distance from his own family cast a dark shadow over his heart. Outside of these moments, Santiago's life felt like it was slowly crumbling. Still, he made the conscious choice to hold on to the joy that Miguel and Isabella brought him, proof that even in the darkest times, there were still flickers of light. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 3 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. As the autumn months arrived, bringing shorter days and colder nights, Santiago's world grew quieter. The once warm, bustling house felt wrapped in a melancholic chill, as though it mirrored the emotional distance that had taken root between him, Carmen, and Rafaela. Carmen, who had been growing increasingly detached, now seemed even more absent. She rarely shared a room with Santiago anymore, always busying herself with household tasks or leaving the house altogether. When Santiago did catch her eye, her gaze seemed empty, as though she was lost in a sea of emotions she couldn't express. The woman who had once been his closest companion now felt like a stranger. Rafaela, too, was hardly home. Her once energetic presence had been replaced by a shadow of avoidance. She spent more time out with friends, coming home late, sometimes not until the early hours of the morning. When she was home, she barely spoke to her parents, retreating to her room like it was a sanctuary from the harsh reality of her father's illness. The house that had once been filled with laughter, conversations, and shared dreams now felt suffocatingly silent. The absence of family dinners, The lively TV shows they used to watch together, all of it had disappeared. Santiago often found himself eating alone. The only sound in the house, the faint hum of the refrigerator or the occasional shuffle of his footsteps. One particularly cold evening, after yet another long absence from Rafaela, Santiago knew he had to confront what was happening. He couldn't ignore the growing cracks in his family any longer. When Rafaela finally walked through the door, her face pale and tired, Santiago mustered the strength to call her over. "Rafaela, we need to talk," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She hesitated but sat down on the couch across from him. "Why are you distancing yourself from us?" he asked gently, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I know this is hard on you, but I need you here with me." Rafaela stared at the floor, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to deal with it, Dad. Seeing you like this, it's too much. I don't know what to do, so I run. I go out and try to forget, even if just for a little while." Santiago's heart broke at her words. He understood her pain, he could see it in her eyes, but he needed her to understand his too. "I know it's hard," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "but I need you, Rafaela. I need my daughter. I don't have much time left, and I can't do this alone." For a moment, it seemed like Rafaela might reach out to him, but then just as quickly she pulled back. She stood abruptly, muttering something about needing space, and retreated to her room, leaving Santiago alone once more in the heavy silence of the living room. As he sat there, staring at the space where his daughter had just been, Santiago felt the full weight of his isolation, Carmen's emotional distance, Rafaela's avoidance. It all felt like too much. But amid this unbearable loneliness, he knew there was still a glimmer of hope in Miguel and Isabella's unwavering support. Though his world was unraveling, Santiago held on to the love and friendship they offered, the only light left in the growing darkness surrounding him. That night, after yet another failed attempt to reach out to Carmen, Santiago lay in bed, consumed by a weight heavier than his illness. His body was deteriorating rapidly, each movement taking more energy than he could muster. But it was the emotional devastation that gnawed at him. The distance between him and his family was no longer just a passing frustration, it was an insurmountable chasm. He could feel something breaking within their household, something deeper than words could explain, and the helplessness left him suffocating in his thoughts. He hoped against all odds that maybe time would heal the cracks, that things would somehow return to the way they used to be. But the next morning, any lingering hope shattered. Carmen had finally made the decision she had been avoiding for weeks. The weight of it pressed on her chest as she prepared breakfast, her hands shaking with every movement. The dread of what she was about to say to Santiago threatened to overwhelm her. But in her mind, she had convinced herself that there was no other choice. After the dishes were cleared, she called Santiago into the living room, asking Rafaela to join as well. The tension in her voice did not go unnoticed by Santiago, who felt an immediate knot tighten in his stomach. As he entered the room, he saw Carmen standing with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her posture defensive, closed off. Rafaela was seated on the couch, her gaze fixed on the floor, avoiding eye contact. Santiago felt the cold weight of dread sinking deeper. He knew this was not going to be an ordinary conversation. He lowered himself into his armchair, his frail body already betraying his nerves, and looked at Carmen, waiting for her to speak. The silence between them was suffocating. "Santiago," Carmen began, her voice low and uncertain, "we need to talk." The room grew even quieter. Santiago watched as Carmen struggled to find the words, and his heart pounded in his chest. Something was wrong. He glanced at Rafaela, who hadn't looked up once. The air was thick with tension, like a storm about to unleash its fury. "I don't know how to say this," Carmen continued, her voice trembling as if each word physically hurt her to speak, "but I can't do this anymore. I can't watch you fade away like this every single day. It's too painful, Santiago. It's tearing me apart." Santiago furrowed his brow in confusion, not fully understanding what she was getting at. "What are you trying to say, Carmen?" She took a step closer, tears brimming in her eyes, threatening to spill over. "Rafaela and we've decided to leave. We can't stay here anymore. We can't watch you suffer like this. I know this seems heartless, but I can't handle it. We can't handle it." Her words hit Santiago like a physical blow. For a moment, time seemed to stop. He looked at Carmen, then at Rafaela, searching for some sign that this was all a misunderstanding, that they weren't saying what he thought they were. But their silence confirmed his worst fear. His family, the two people he had dedicated his life to, were abandoning him. The shock quickly morphed into a sharp, unbearable pain, as if his heart were being torn to shreds. "You're leaving me," his voice cracked, weaker than he intended, but laden with the depth of his hurt. Raffaele finally lifted her gaze, her eyes swimming in guilt and sorrow. "Dad, we're not trying to hurt you, but this is destroying us too. I can't bear to watch you deteriorate like this. I don't know how to deal with it, so I can't stay." Santiago's throat tightened, the weight of their betrayal settling in his chest like a heavy stone. "I stood by both of you through every hardship, every difficult moment. I gave everything I had to protect and care for you. And now when I need you most, you're walking away." Carmen began to cry openly, but she didn't deny what Santiago was saying. She didn't try to comfort him. She simply wept, as if her tears could somehow justify what she was doing. "I know it's horrible," Carmen whispered through her sobs, "but I'm at my breaking point, Santiago. I can't keep pretending that everything's going to be okay, because it's not." Santiago stared at her, his mind reeling. The ground beneath him felt as if it were crumbling, and he was helpless to stop it. These were the people he had built his life with, the ones he had always trusted. And now, in the final, most vulnerable moments of his life, they were choosing to leave him. The reality of their decision was almost too painful to comprehend. The silence that followed was thick with sorrow. Santiago couldn't even look at them anymore. He closed his eyes, feeling the sting of tears he had been fighting back. He wanted to plead, to beg them to stay, but he knew it was pointless. Their minds were already made up. He had never felt so utterly abandoned, so completely alone. The love that he had relied on for so many years had crumbled in the face of his suffering. "Do what you think is best," he finally whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "If you can't handle this, then I won't ask you to stay." He felt the last of his strength leave him as he spoke those words, a hollow sadness filling the space where hope once resided. Carmen and Raffaele stood there, saying nothing more. The only sound was Carmen's quiet sobs, while Raffaella looked away, unable to meet her father's eyes. Without another word, Santiago leaned back in his chair, the weight of their decision crashing down on him like an avalanche. He had always been a man of strength, a man who fought through life's toughest battles. But now, in the face of this ultimate betrayal, he didn't know how to keep fighting. The pain of abandonment was far more unbearable than the cancer that was ravaging his body. The physical suffering was nothing compared to the devastation of losing the two people he had loved the most. And so, as Carmen and Raffaele quietly left the room, Santiago was left alone in the silence, the heavy truth settling into his bones. They were gone emotionally, if not physically yet, and no matter how much time he had left, he knew that this would be the final chapter of his life, facing death not just from illness, but from the abandonment of the family he had cherished so deeply. Carmen and Raffaele's departure left Santiago engulfed in a void so deep that it felt as though his very soul had been hollowed out. The silence of the house, once filled with the sounds of laughter, conversations, and everyday life, now hung like a suffocating weight over him. The promises of support, the reassurances that they would stand by him, had all been shattered. He was alone now, abandoned in the home that once felt like a sanctuary but now seemed to echo with loss. In the days following their departure, Santiago watched them pack their lives away. He observed them silent and broken, as Carmen and Raffaele moved through the house, removing their presence bit by bit. Carmen didn't meet his eyes once, her actions robotic, as though each task took her further from the emotional reality of what she was doing. Raffaele, guilt plain to see, avoided Santiago too, leaving the words that should have been spoken hanging in the air, unaddressed and unresolved. When the day finally arrived, when they stood at the threshold of their old lives and their new, Santiago stood at the door, feeling as if the last remnants of his heart were being ripped away. Carmen and Raffaele loaded the car in tense, uncomfortable silence. There were no warm goodbyes, no heartfelt moments of reconciliation. Instead, there was only the oppressive absence of any closure, and that silence spoke volumes. "Dad, I'm sorry," Raffaele whispered, the guilt in her voice barely contained, as she climbed into the car. It was the only thing she could muster, the only thing she had to offer as a farewell. Santiago, unable to speak through the lump in his throat, simply nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. He watched as they drove away, standing there long after the car had disappeared. Only when the sound of the engine finally faded did the crushing reality of their abandonment fully sink in. The people he had sacrificed everything for, the people he had loved more than anything, had chosen to leave him in his most vulnerable moment. As the tears he had been holding back finally spilled down his face, the pain he felt wasn't just from the disease ravaging his body, it was from the deep, emotional wound of abandonment. The kind of pain that comes from realizing the people you believed would never leave had chosen to do exactly that. And now, in the emptiness of his home, Santiago was left to confront the brutal truth that he would face his final days entirely alone. The house, once filled with warmth and joy, now felt like a tomb. The memories embedded in every room, in every piece of furniture, became painful reminders of the life he had lost. Santiago sat in his armchair, staring blankly into the space that used to be filled with his family. The loneliness wrapped itself around him, tightening with every passing moment. He felt a crushing helplessness, a sense of being abandoned not only by his loved ones but by life itself. The silence after Carmen and Rafael's departure was almost unbearable. It clung to every corner of the house, amplifying his isolation. Each passing day seemed longer than the one before, and Santiago, weakened by both his illness and emotional torment, felt his strength slipping away. The fight he had once had the will to keep going was fading as fast as the support he had once relied on. But Miguel, always attuned to his friend's state, noticed something was wrong. He had continued to visit regularly with his daughter, Isabella, who had been helping care for Santiago. On one of those visits, as Miguel approached the door, he felt an inexplicable heaviness. When he knocked, the delay in Santiago's answer only deepened his concern. After a few long moments, the door creaked open, revealing a much weaker Santiago than the one Miguel had last seen. His face was pale, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of countless sleepless nights. He tried to offer a smile, but it was forced, hiding the sorrow he carried. "Santiago, what's going on?" Miguel asked, stepping inside with an immediate sense of unease. He looked around the room and noticed something strange: the absence of Carmen and Rafaela's belongings. Luggage that had always been there for their frequent trips was gone. "Where are Carmen and Rafaela?" Miguel asked, his voice heavy with concern, though deep down, he already knew something was wrong. Santiago let out a long, weary sigh, as if the weight of the world rested on his frail shoulders. He sat down heavily in his chair, feeling the exhaustion settle deeper in his bones. "They left, Miguel. They couldn't handle it anymore. My illness, watching me like this. They decided they couldn't stay." The words hung in the air, and for a moment Miguel didn't speak. He stood there, trying to absorb what he had just heard. Disbelief quickly gave way to anger, a slow simmering rage that threatened to boil over. He had known Santiago his entire life. He had seen the sacrifices, the love, the loyalty Santiago had always shown his family. The thought that they could abandon him now when he needed them the most was incomprehensible. "They left you?" Miguel's voice was low, almost shaking with controlled anger. He couldn't believe that Carmen and Rafaela would leave Santiago like this. Santiago nodded, his eyes cast downward. "They couldn't bear it, Miguel. They said it was too hard, too painful, and so they left." If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 4 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Miguel clenched his fists, trying to keep his emotions in check. He had never been a man prone to anger, but seeing his friend like this, so broken and abandoned, ignited a fire within him. He had known Santiago as a man who had always been strong, always there for the people he loved. And now, in his time of need, they had turned their backs on him. "How could they do this to you?" Miguel finally asked, his voice thick with sadness. Santiago's gaze was distant, his heart too shattered to muster an answer. "I don't know," he whispered. I thought they'd be here until the end. But I guess not everyone can handle watching someone they love fall apart." Miguel shook his head, unable to comprehend it. He walked over to Santiago, placing a firm but gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone, Santiago. I'm here. Isabella's here. We won't leave you." Tears welled up in Santiago's eyes, the first glimmer of emotion he had shown since Carmen and Rafaela's departure. He had never doubted Miguel's loyalty, but hearing it spoken aloud in this moment of profound despair brought a small sense of relief. "Thank you," Santiago whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for not leaving." Miguel nodded, his own heart heavy with both sadness and determination. "We're in this together, my friend. You don't have to face any of this alone." And in that moment, despite the overwhelming grief and loneliness Santiago felt, the presence of true friendship gave him a flicker of hope. Miguel and Isabella's unwavering support reminded him that, though his family had left him, There were still people who cared deeply and who would stand by him in the face of even the darkest of days. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. For now, at least, it was enough. Isabella had remained quiet throughout the emotional exchange, her heart swelling with both sadness and resolve. Santiago had always been more than just her father's friend. He was like a second father to her, a figure of stability and wisdom throughout her life. Seeing him now abandoned by his family was unbearable. Deep within, she had already made up her mind, and as Miguel voiced his decision, Isabella stood by his side, ready to fully commit to what she knew was the right thing to do. "Santiago," Miguel said firmly after the weighty silence, "you're not going through this alone. Isabella and I are moving in with you, and we'll take care of everything." Santiago's eyes widened in disbelief. "Miguel, you can't do that. I don't want to be a burden on you or Isabella. You have your own lives to live." Miguel met his gaze with unwavering determination. "Santiago, you've never been a burden. You're family to us. After Katerina passed, it's been just me and Isabella. We don't have a large family or a big life that ties us down. We've made this decision together. This isn't about sacrifice. It's about love, about choosing to stand by you when you need us most. There's nothing more important to us than being here with you." Isabella nodded, her voice steady but full of warmth. "Uncle Santiago, you've always been there for us, like a part of our family. We want to be here for you now, not out of obligation, but because we love you. You're not just my dad's friend, you're part of our family. Let us do this for you." Santiago's chest tightened as tears welled up in his eyes, but this time, they weren't from sorrow or despair. He was overwhelmed with gratitude and love. The people standing before him weren't bound by blood, but they were offering something deeper: unconditional love and loyalty. In a moment when he felt he had lost everything, Miguel and Isabella had given him something he thought was gone forever: a sense of belonging, a family. Miguel and Isabella's move was swift. Within days, they had packed up their essentials and relocated to Santiago's home. The guest room was transformed into a cozy space for Isabella, while Miguel took the room next door, ensuring he would be close enough to help Santiago if needed during the night. Their presence immediately lifted the atmosphere of the house. The once stifling silence that had hung over Santiago's life was replaced by the warmth of conversation, laughter, and companionship. Miguel, with his light-hearted humor, had a knack for making Santiago laugh, even on days when his body felt the weakest. Whether it was through recalling an old memory or telling a story about their childhood mischief, Miguel had a way of easing the burden of illness through joy. Isabella, with her nurturing spirit, cared for Santiago in ways that were both practical and profoundly emotional. She handled his medications, monitored his health, and ensured he was always comfortable. But beyond the caregiving, it was the small moments, the way she listened, the way she sat with him in silence when words weren't necessary, that touched Santiago deeply. As the weeks passed, the bond between the three of them grew even stronger. They became a family in every sense of the word, one built not on obligation but on love and mutual respect. Miguel and Isabella's devotion to Santiago went beyond caregiving. They provided him with the emotional support and connection he had been starved of since Carmen and Rafaela's departure. It was this love that began to mend the deep wounds left by his abandonment. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Santiago felt at peace. The pain of being left behind by the family he had spent his life building was still there, but it was no longer the overwhelming force that consumed him. Miguel and Isabella filled the empty spaces in his heart with their kindness, their laughter, and their unwavering presence. Santiago, who had once resisted the idea of being taken care of, now welcomed their help and their company. He no longer felt like a burden. Instead, he saw himself as part of a family, one that had chosen to be there with him to the end. The house, which had once felt like a tomb, was now filled with the sounds of life again. Meals were shared at the table, where stories and memories flowed freely. The nights, once so long and solitary, became a time for deep conversations. Miguel and Santiago would sit together for hours, reminiscing about their lives, their adventures, and even their regrets. Isabella, always eager to learn from their experiences, would often join them, listening intently as the two men she admired most in the world shared their wisdom. "Remember that time we took that ridiculous road trip in that beat-up car?" Miguel would start grinning. "I swear we didn't think we'd make it halfway, but somehow we did." Santiago, with a weak but genuine smile, would nod. "It was a miracle that car made it back at all. Your idea of adventure has always been a little reckless." Laughter would fill the room, and for those moments the illness felt distant. Santiago, for the first time in months, felt lighter, as though the weight of his disease had been momentarily lifted by the sheer force of love and friendship. Isabella, in her quiet way, would absorb it all, occasionally chiming in with her questions or reflections. She cherished these conversations, seeing them as lessons in both life and love. She admired Santiago's strength, but more than that, she admired the grace with which he was facing his final days. His acceptance, his ability to still find joy amidst the pain, was something that left a deep impression on her. In those moments, Santiago realized something profound. The family he had thought he had lost wasn't defined by blood or obligation. It was defined by love, by choice, by the people who chose to be by his side when everything else had fallen away. Miguel and Isabella had brought light back into his life, and even though his days were numbered, he no longer feared the end. He knew that whatever time he had left, he wouldn't face it alone. Santiago, once so fearful of being a burden, now saw himself as the recipient of a gift he had never expected: unconditional love from the family he hadn't realized he had. And as the days passed, he felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him, knowing that in his darkest moments, he had found something truly beautiful. Santiago was acutely aware that his days were numbered, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a quiet peace within him. The despair and loneliness that once threatened to overwhelm him had been replaced by a sense of comfort, knowing that Miguel and Isabella were by his side, devoted to him in his final days. Their presence was a lifeline, filling his heart with a strength that helped him face each day, despite the growing exhaustion and pain that racked his body. Miguel and Isabella's decision to move into his home wasn't just an act of compassion. It was a profound act of love that had saved him from the darkness he once feared would consume him. Santiago was deeply grateful, and he often found himself reflecting on how fortunate he was to have such unwavering support. Despite the relentless march of illness, despite the heartbreak of being abandoned by Carmen and Rafaela, he could still find hope, love, and goodness in the world. But even as Santiago clung to this newfound peace, his body continued to weaken. Each movement, no matter how small, became a monumental task. His illness was overtaking him, and the battle he had fought so valiantly was nearing its inevitable end. Along with the physical toll came the quiet fear of another kind of burden, the financial one. Santiago was painfully aware of the mounting costs associated with his care. While no treatment could cure him, the palliative care and medical interventions were crucial to his comfort, and the costs were rapidly depleting what remained of his financial reserves. Late one sleepless night, as Santiago lay awake in bed, the weight of a difficult decision pressed down on him. The car dealership, his life's work, had always been more than a business. It was the embodiment of his hard work, determination, and everything he had accomplished. Letting it go felt like losing a part of himself, but Santiago knew what had to be done. He couldn't bear the thought of leaving behind financial difficulties for those who remained after he was gone. It was time to sell the dealership. The next morning, after summoning the strength to face the day, Santiago called Miguel for a private conversation. They sat together in the living room, the morning light casting soft shadows across the room. Santiago's voice was calm but resolute as he explained his decision. "Miguel, I've made up my mind," Santiago began, his gaze steady but somber. "I need to sell the dealership. I can't manage the business anymore, and the money will be needed for my care, and for whatever comes after." Miguel listened intently, his heart heavy. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing Santiago say the words out loud felt like a punch to the gut. He knew how much the dealership meant to his friend, how it was the culmination of decades of sacrifice and ambition. To let it go now, in the final chapter of Santiago's life, felt like another profound loss. "Are you sure about this?" Miguel asked gently, his voice filled with concern. "I know how much the dealership means to you. It's not just a business, it's everything you've built." Santiago nodded, his expression weary but determined. "I'm sure. It's what has to be done. I don't want to leave any debts or financial problems behind." "But Miguel," he added, his voice softening, "please don't tell Isabella why I'm selling it. She's already doing so much for me. I don't want her to worry even more than she already does." Miguel, ever the loyal and steadfast friend, respected Santiago's wishes. Though it pained him to see his friend let go of something so dear, he agreed to handle the sale without hesitation. Over the next few days, Miguel quietly began the process of finding a buyer and handling the necessary paperwork. Santiago, for his part, did his best not to dwell on the matter, but with every signature on the documents, he felt the bittersweet weight of closing a chapter of his life. The dealership had been more than just a livelihood, it had been a part of his identity. And now, he was preparing to part with it forever. As the sale progressed, Santiago wrestled with his emotions in silence. On one hand, he knew that this was the right decision. He didn't want to leave behind chaos or financial strain for Miguel, Isabella, or anyone else who might have to manage his affairs after he was gone. But on the other hand, letting go of the dealership felt like letting go of a piece of his soul. It was a symbolic farewell to the life he had built, the legacy he had worked so hard to create. But through it all, Santiago found solace in the fact that he wasn't facing this alone. Miguel's steadfast support made the process more bearable, and Isabella's constant care gave him the emotional strength he needed to navigate these final days. Every time Miguel would update him on the progress of the sale, Santiago would quietly listen, knowing that he was doing what needed to be done, no matter how much it hurt. Finally, the day came when the sale was completed. Santiago sat with the final documents in front of him, feeling the weight of years and memories in his hands. As he signed the last piece of paper, he closed his eyes, letting the significance of the moment wash over him. It was done. The dealership was no longer his, and with that, a chapter of his life had come to a close. That night, Santiago sat quietly in his armchair, reflecting on all that had happened. He had lost so much: his health, his family, and now the business he had dedicated his life to. And yet, there was still a deep sense of peace within him. Through all of this loss, he had gained something even more valuable: the unwavering love and loyalty of Miguel and Isabella. The house, once filled with silence and sorrow, had become a place of warmth again, thanks to the presence of the two people who had chosen to stand by him when no one else would. The future was uncertain, and Santiago knew that his time was running out. But he also knew that when the end came, he wouldn't face it alone. That knowledge, above all else, gave him the strength to face whatever remained of his journey with grace and dignity. In the quiet of that night, Santiago whispered a small prayer of gratitude, not for what he had lost, but for what he had gained in the love of true friends. And with that, he allowed himself to rest, knowing that he was ready for whatever came next. As the ink dried on the final papers, signaling the completion of the sale, Santiago stood motionless for a few moments, gazing at the dealership that had once been the centerpiece of his life. His eyes traced the familiar contours of the building, every corner, every detail etched into his memory after so many years of dedication. It wasn't just a business, it was a symbol of his hard work, his dreams, and his passion. He felt a complex mix of emotions swelling in his chest: relief that a chapter was closing, and sadness that he had to let go of something that had meant so much to him. The dealership had been more than just a place of work, it had been a sanctuary, a place where he had found purpose and pride. But now the time had come to release it, even if it broke his heart to do so. The decision to sell hadn't been easy. It was one of the hardest choices Santiago had ever made. For weeks he had wrestled with the idea, weighed the pros and cons, and agonized over what the sale would mean for his future. But in the end, he knew he had no choice. His illness had progressed, and each passing day made it clearer that he could no longer manage the business he had once run with such vigor. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 5 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. It wasn't just his body that was failing him, his spirit too was weary. The endless doctor's visits, the treatments, the fatigue, it was all too much. He needed to think practically now, not just for himself but for those he loved. With the proceeds from the sale, he could ensure that his final days would be spent in comfort and peace, without the added worry of financial strain. More importantly, he could protect his loved ones from the burden of his medical expenses and the uncertainties that lay ahead. As he stood outside the dealership for the last time, Santiago felt a strange weight lift from his shoulders. It was as if a great burden had been released, even though sorrow still lingered in his heart. There was a quiet resignation in his farewell to the place that had given him so much. But there was also a profound sense of acceptance. He had done what needed to be done, and that in itself brought some peace. He could finally shift his focus away from the day-to-day struggles of running a business and onto something far more important: spending the precious time he had left with the people who truly mattered. Santiago was acutely aware that his time was limited. The illness had begun to take its toll more severely now, draining him of the energy that had once defined him. Each day he felt a little weaker, a little more fragile, and the reality of his condition became harder to ignore. But Santiago was not a man to dwell in fear or self-pity. He knew what was coming, but he faced it with the same quiet determination that had carried him through life's other challenges. Yet, Despite his calm acceptance, there were still loose ends that weighed heavily on his mind, unfinished business that needed to be resolved before he could truly find peace. Chief among them was ensuring that his final wishes would be respected after he was gone. One crisp morning, after days of reflection, Santiago made up his mind. He called upon his dear friend Miguel, the one person he knew he could trust implicitly. "Miguel, take me to see Dr. Alejandro," Santiago said, his voice steady yet weary. Alejandro had been Santiago's lawyer for years, a man of integrity who had always handled his affairs with care. Though Miguel offered to accompany him, Santiago gently but firmly insisted on going alone. "This is something I have to face by myself," he explained, his tone leaving no room for argument. Miguel, understanding the gravity of the moment, simply nodded, offering a silent show of support. Alejandro's office was a haven of calm, its walls lined with books and papers that exuded a sense of order and reliability. But as Santiago sat across from the lawyer, the peace of the surroundings was in stark contrast to the storm of emotions swirling within him. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice steady but laced with the weight of everything he had been carrying. He told Alejandro about the changes in his life, the increasing distance between him and his daughters, Carmen and Rafaela, who had grown distant and cold over the years. Their estrangement pained him deeply, but he had long since come to accept that some relationships were beyond repair. Then, Santiago spoke of the unwavering loyalty of Miguel and Isabella, two people who had stood by him through the hardest of times, offering not just support but a love that had sustained him in ways he hadn't expected. Alejandro listened intently, as he always did, his pen moving across the paper as he took notes, ensuring every detail of Santiago's wishes was recorded. He knew the importance of this moment and the weight it carried for his client. These were not just legal documents, this was Santiago's final legacy, the last chance to ensure that his affairs would be handled exactly as he wished. With everything set in place, Alejandro handed Santiago the documents to sign. Santiago's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the pen, but there was no hesitation. He knew this was the right thing to do, no matter how difficult it felt. With a few strokes of the pen, it was done. He had secured the future he wanted for those he cared about. Before he left, Santiago looked Alejandro in the eye, his expression calm but resolute. "Promise me you'll take care of this when the time comes," he said quietly. Alejandro, understanding the gravity of the request, nodded solemnly. "You have my word," he replied, and Santiago knew that promise would be honored without question. As Santiago walked out of the office and rejoined Miguel, who had been waiting patiently outside, a surprising sense of peace washed over him. He didn't feel the need to share the details of what had transpired. Miguel would understand without needing to know. What mattered now was that Santiago had taken care of what needed to be done, and for the first time in a long while, he could focus entirely on the present, on the time he had left with the people who truly mattered. In the days that followed, Santiago found himself enveloped in an unexpected calm. The physical pain that gnawed at him daily seemed less important in the face of the emotional peace he had finally found. Miguel and Isabella were always by his side, tending to his needs with a love and devotion that transcended mere duty. Their friendship had deepened over the years, evolving into something profound, a bond of genuine care and affection that only grew stronger as Santiago's strength waned. Santiago could feel the end approaching. His body was weakening, and even the simplest tasks now required immense effort, but there was no fear in his heart. He had lived a full life, and though it was ending sooner than he had hoped, he was at peace with the inevitable. The nights were often spent in quiet conversation or comfortable silence, with Miguel and Isabella keeping him company, their presence a comforting reminder that he was not alone. There was nothing left to fear. Santiago had taken care of the important things and made the hard decisions, and now he was ready to face whatever came next. And then, one morning, just as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the windows, Santiago's journey came to an end. He took his final breath, his hand clasped in Miguel's, while Isabella wept softly at his side. It was a solemn moment, filled with both profound sadness and deep gratitude for the time they had shared. Santiago passed peacefully, surrounded by the love and friendship that had carried him through his final days. The news of Santiago's passing spread quickly. Carmen and Rafaela, who had long distanced themselves from their father, soon heard the news and returned. For them, Santiago's death was not just the loss of a parent, it was an opportunity, a chance to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Regret and guilt may have tugged at their hearts, but the lure of inheritance was stronger. When they arrived at the house, however, they were met by Miguel, who stood waiting for them at the entrance. His expression was calm, but there was a steely resolve in his eyes. He was not angry, but he was prepared. He had promised Santiago that he would protect his legacy, and he intended to keep that promise, no matter what. There would be no easy claims to the life Santiago had worked so hard to build. Miguel would ensure that Santiago's wishes were honored, just as he had asked. "You've returned," Miguel said, his voice calm and devoid of surprise, as if he had been expecting this moment for some time. Carmen, standing at the entrance, attempted to maintain her composure, but the nervousness in her trembling hands betrayed her. "We've come to settle things," she began, her voice wavering. "We are Santiago's family, and we have a right to what he left behind." She tried to sound assertive, but it was clear she was holding back her emotions. Rafaela, standing a step behind her mother, couldn't bring herself to look Miguel in the eyes. The weight of guilt and regret hung heavily on her shoulders, pressing down with the reminder that they had abandoned Santiago when he needed them most. Miguel remained composed, his expression unreadable. "Santiago knew you would return," he replied softly, his words carrying a weight that made Carmen flinch. "He expected this and took the necessary precautions. Before he left us, he made sure everything was in order, so that his final wishes would be carried out exactly as he wanted." Miguel's words settled into the air like an unspoken judgment, filling the space with an almost unbearable tension. Carmen and Rafaela stood frozen, absorbing the full meaning of what he had just said. There was no way to turn back time, no undoing the distance they had placed between themselves and their father. And now they found themselves before a man whom Santiago had trusted implicitly to ensure his last wishes were respected. Santiago left very clear instructions. Miguel continued, his voice firm yet without a trace of malice. "You'll hear everything soon enough when we meet with the lawyer. But know this, he did not forget the choices made in his final months." His words landed heavily, each one cutting into Carmen like a cold truth. She had always known that abandoning her father would be hard to forgive, but she hadn't expected Santiago to be so explicit in his final decisions. Rafaela's emotions, held in check for so long, finally spilled over. Tears welled up in her eyes and began to stream down her cheeks uncontrollably. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of her remorse. "I know I made a terrible mistake, but it's too late to fix it now." Her words were filled with anguish, as if the realization of what she had lost had just now fully hit her. Miguel turned to her, his gaze softening slightly, but there was no escape from the truth. "What's done is done, Rafaela," he said gently, "but Santiago's choices reflect how he felt in his last days. It's not for me to change." The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of Santiago's absence palpable in the room. Each of them, Carmen, Rafaela, and Miguel, was lost in their thoughts, grappling with the reality of the situation. What remained was the inevitable confrontation with Santiago's decisions. The day of the will reading arrived, and the air in Alejandro's office was thick with unspoken tension. Carmen and Rafaela sat side by side, their faces pale and expressions tense, trying to maintain their composure in the face of the unknown. Across from them sat Miguel and Isabella, quiet but resolute, their presence a reminder of the unwavering loyalty they had shown Santiago. Alejandro, the lawyer Santiago had trusted, sat behind his desk, his expression professional but laced with the solemnity of the moment. Alejandro took a deep breath, gathering the papers before him. When everyone had settled, he began reading in a calm, steady voice, though the weight of each word seemed to grow heavy with every sentence. "This will reflect the final wishes of Santiago Perez, drafted and signed in my presence just weeks before his passing." As the lawyer continued, it became clear that this wasn't just a legal document, it was Santiago's last opportunity to speak to his family. Through Alejandro's measured reading, Santiago expressed the love he had always held for his daughters, but also the profound sadness he felt at being abandoned during his most vulnerable moments. His words were candid and honest, but not filled with bitterness. Rather, there was a clarity in them that left Carmen and Rafaela visibly shaken. Santiago acknowledged the pain he had endured, but in the same breath, he spoke of forgiveness and the hope that his daughters would find peace in their lives. Alejandro paused, letting the impact of Santiago's words sink in. Then, after a brief silence, he continued. "However," he said, "Santiago made decisions that reflect the reality of what transpired in his final days." The tension in the room heightened as Alejandro reached the part of the will that detailed the distribution of Santiago's assets. The air was thick with anticipation as he revealed that the bulk of Santiago's estate, including the house and the proceeds from the sale of his beloved dealership, would go to Miguel and Isabella. The room fell deathly quiet. Carmen sat still, her face drained of color, unable to process what she had just heard. There was a mix of shock, disbelief, and a deep sadness in her eyes. She had always known, deep down, that her father might not have forgiven her easily. But to be excluded so completely from the inheritance was a blow she had not anticipated. It was as though all the consequences of her actions had finally caught up with her in one cruel moment. Rafaela, meanwhile, broke down completely. Sobs racked her body as she realized the full extent of what had been lost, not just the inheritance, but the opportunity to make things right with her father. Every word that Alejandro had read echoed in her mind, each one a painful reminder of how she had failed him when he needed her the most. Santiago had left her a small sum of money, a gesture that felt more like a token of what could have been a final attempt to give her something to start anew, but not enough to erase the guilt she carried. Alejandro, ever professional, continued with the reading, explaining that Santiago's decision had been a deliberate one. He had chosen to leave his fortune to those who had been by his side in his darkest moments, those who had shown him love when he needed it most. Miguel and Isabella had cared for him selflessly, and Santiago wanted to ensure that their future was secure. He had given them not just his gratitude, but his legacy. As the reading concluded, the room remained heavy with emotion. Carmen sat quietly, her expression unreadable, while Rafaela's sobs had subsided into quiet tears. Miguel and Isabella, too, sat in silence, understanding the gravity of the moment. They had not expected Santiago's generosity, but they knew the depth of his gratitude for their care. Now, all that was left was to honor Santiago's memory and carry out his wishes. The meeting ended, but the emotional aftermath lingered. Carmen and Rafaela left the office in silence, each carrying the weight of their regrets. There was no anger in their departure, only a profound sense of loss of the father they had forsaken and the future they could no longer claim. As they walked away, the reality of Santiago's choices settled heavily upon them, a reminder that love, loyalty, and regret all have their consequences. Miguel and Isabella received the news of Santiago's will with a mix of humility and deep sadness. The inheritance, while substantial, was not what mattered most to them. It was a tangible representation of the gratitude and love Santiago had felt for them, but it also carried the weight of responsibility. They had lost someone who was more than just a friend. Santiago had become like family to them, and the void he left behind could never be filled by material wealth. No amount of money could replace the warmth of his presence or the memories they had shared. After the will was read, Alejandro gently closed the document and surveyed the room. His voice was calm and deliberate as he spoke. Santiago made his decisions with great care and clarity. He wanted you all to understand that his choices reflected what he experienced in his final days. Now, it is up to each of you to move forward, to honor his legacy in your way. His words lingered in the air, heavy with the weight of Santiago's parting decisions. For a few moments, the room remained still, as if everyone was grappling with their emotions in silence. Carmen and Rafaela were the first to rise. Without saying a word, they left the office, their footsteps echoing down the hallway. Carmen's face was unreadable, her expression distant, as if lost in her thoughts. She carried the burden of her past actions, though she remained outwardly composed. Rafaela, however, could no longer hold back her tears. She wept quietly as they left, the realization sinking in that all the regret in the world couldn't change the choices she had made or the time she had lost with her father. Miguel and Isabella remained behind, staying for a few moments to thank Alejandro for his meticulous handling of Santiago's wishes. They knew that the lawyer had been instrumental in ensuring that Santiago's final desires were respected, and their gratitude was genuine. As they exited the office, Miguel gently placed his hand on Isabella's shoulder, his touch comforting and steady. "We will honor Santiago's memory in the way he would have wanted," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet resolve. Isabella, her eyes glistening with emotion, nodded. She felt not only the responsibility but also the privilege of carrying on the life that Santiago had envisioned for them. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 6 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. In the months that followed, life changed significantly for everyone who had been touched by Santiago's passing. For Isabella, the inheritance became more than just financial security. It was the key to her long-held dream of becoming a nurse. With renewed purpose and determination, she pursued her studies with vigor, driven by the desire to honor the opportunity Santiago had given her. Every step she took in her education felt like a tribute to the man who had believed in her. and she worked harder than ever before, knowing that she was living out a future that Santiago had helped make possible. Miguel, meanwhile, dedicated himself to keeping Santiago's memory alive in his quiet way. He visited Santiago's grave regularly, bringing fresh flowers and talking to him as if he were still there. He would sit by the headstone, reminiscing about the good times they had shared, telling stories and expressing his gratitude for everything Santiago had done for him and Isabella. These visits became a ritual for Miguel, a way of staying connected to the man who had been such an important part of his life. Carmen and Rafaela, on the other hand, faced the harsh consequences of their past actions. Carmen, now isolated, was forced to confront the reality of the choices she had made. Day after day, she reflected on what could have been, how different things might have turned out if she hadn't distanced herself from her father. The regret gnawed at her, a constant reminder that the time they had lost could never be reclaimed. Yet, despite the pain, Carmen found herself slowly coming to terms with her mistakes, though the process was painful and isolating. For Rafaela, the journey was one of both redemption and self-discovery. The realization of how deeply she had hurt her father weighed heavily on her, but rather than being paralyzed by guilt, she chose to live in a way that honored Santiago's memory. She embarked on a path of self-reflection, seeking to understand where she had gone wrong and how she could grow from the experience. It wasn't an easy road. There were many moments of deep sadness and regret, but Rafaela was determined to live a life that her father could have been proud of. She began volunteering, dedicating herself to causes that helped others, in the hopes that by giving back, she could somehow atone for the time she had lost with her father. Though Santiago was gone, his presence remained with all of them in different ways. Miguel and Isabella, bound by love and loyalty, carried Santiago's legacy with dignity, while Carmen and Rafaela faced their emotional reckoning. In the end, Santiago's decisions not only secured the futures of those who had stood by him, but also forced those who had abandoned him to confront the consequences of their choices. Each of them, in their way, would be shaped by Santiago's final act of love, and his memory would continue to influence their lives long after he was gone. As we come to the end of Santiago's story, we are reminded of the profound impact our actions have on the people we love, and how the choices we make today can shape our futures and the legacies we leave behind. Santiago's journey is one of love, loyalty, regret, and redemption, and through his story we see the importance of living with intention, honoring those who stand by us, and confronting the consequences of our decisions. What have you learned from Santiago's story? Reflect on one thing that resonated with you the most and share how you will apply it in your own life. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below and let us know. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay connected and see more content like this. Thank you for watching.